Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our friends in Europe. My name is Alina Polyakova. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, coming to you from Washington, D.C. CEPA is a US-based think tank devoted to promoting close and enduring ties between Europe and the United States. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you following along on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube to this fireside chat on Europe's agenda to counter disinformation with the Vice President of the European Commission, Věra Jourová. The pandemic has certainly revealed how large the threat of disinformation continues to be in our democracies. In 2014, CEPA was the first organization to raise the alarm about Moscow's disinformation efforts, with our report winning the information war. Of course, over the last 6 years, we've not only seen Russia take a much more aggressive stance in trying to influence and undermine democracies across the world with information influence operations, but we now have seen other state actors adopt and improve on the Russian playbook. Countries like China, Iran, North Korea, and others are now very much involved in foreign influence operations in our digital information environment. One thing that's become clear over the last years is that we cannot solve this problem alone. We have to come together as a community of like-minded democracies, as a transatlantic alliance, to develop a whole of society approach. And that, of course, involves governments, which we'll be talking about today, about how the EU and the European Commission are acting to counter disinformation and build democratic resilience, but also actions by industry and the social media platforms to curb the exploitation of their platforms. And lastly, by civil society and independent journalists and media groups to provide accurate information at a time when people are much more vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation. Recently, the European Commission has unveiled its action plan to fight disinformation. It's been in development for some time. And later this year, the Commission will reveal the European Democracy Action Plan, drawing a clear link between our resilience against disinformation and the resilience of our democracies. For those of you following along, and if you want to ask a question of the Commissioner, please do so by tweeting at us at CEPA using the hashtag Common Crisis. Now, before further ado, let me open up by welcoming our distinguished speaker, Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency, who's been leading the effort to counter disinformation in the European Union, Věra Jourová, a friend of CEPA's for many years. And I'm sure this is going to be a lively and informative conversation. Madam Vice President, thank you so much for joining us and for taking the time to speak with us and our audience today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And thank you for confirming that I am a long-lasting friend of CEPA. Thank you.
So let me just get right into the conversation with my first question. As I mentioned, the European Commission recently adopted its communication fighting disinformation, specifically in the context of COVID-19. Of course, we've seen an increase in disinformation narratives from state actors, most notably Russia and China. And the Commission has also come out, and you have come out very strongly to expose some of these campaigns. But as a starting point, could you talk us through the main points of that communication and how the Commission plans to fight coordinated disinformation campaigns from state actors?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, we had to do it. We had to come up with the plan how to address and react on a massive wave of disinformation linked to the coronavirus. And we saw all sorts of very dangerous stuff. Consumers, hoaxes, selling magical solutions, but also dangerous conspiracy theories or advice dangerous for human health, like drinking bleach and these kind of things. And this was not only a threat to citizens, but also a threat to the public response to the pandemic. It was the threat to the confidence of the people that democratic institutions can manage the crisis. So we had to react. Our communication did two things. First, there is a comprehensive overview of what has been done, all the measures taken, and identify potential gaps. And second, indeed, as you mentioned, everybody has a task. It's a collective one. And so the communication includes also the to-do list for all involved, for the Commission, for the member states, and especially the platforms, which is, if I may say, the battlefield. Because my colleague Joseph Borrell said that this is the battle of narratives, and we cannot help it now, and the platforms enable the disinformation to be spread very easily, and you know that the disinformation flies quicker and sells better. So it's a very, very powerful weapon in the hands of our enemies. And not only Russia and China was mentioned in the communication, we also have to put our own house in order. We have the very agile producers of disinformation in the EU itself. And this communication is the COVID-related material where we involve the health sector to defend its truths, its facts, because we do not want to fight disinformation with some kind of censoring or censorship and removing the fake news. We need always those who are the owners of the facts and whose obligation is to inform the public about using trustworthy information to do so. So now it was the health sector, but later this year, as you mentioned, it is our task to come with the European Democracy Action Plan, where we will look at how to protect elections. It is, I think, one of the crucial tasks of the Commission.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. Let me just follow up on a couple of things you already put on the table. One, the connection between countering disinformation and building democratic resilience. I think that's a connection that is important to discuss. And I wanted to get you to talk a little bit about the idea of, on the one hand, presenting a positive image of Europe as a whole, a positive image of European values and principles, which are, of course, universal values and principles around individual rights and freedoms. Yet on the other hand, how do you do that while still countering malicious or malign disinformation campaigns? So how do you see that link between countering disinformation while at the same time investing in democratic values and principles at home?
Well, we have to simply do much more to promote the values and decency and civilized communication. And I will use the word to promote the truth. And every time the politicians start speaking about the truth, it's a very sensitive moment, because when I discuss with many partners what the truth is, immediately we get into the question what propaganda is. That it is also a question of propaganda and promoting somebody's political opinions and so on. Our communication says clearly the EU has to increase and improve our strategic communication and to explain the people what we are doing, what the democratic institutions are doing in this COVID time, and to convince them that democracy can work much better than authoritarian regimes, and that informed citizens are much better themselves to protect themselves than some manipulated crowd, which lives in fear and which is afraid of the future, and the crowd which doesn't have the proper trustworthy information. And now it was such situation when for very serious reason the people were uncertain. We have never experienced such a crisis. And that's why it was so important that we come with trustworthy information so that the people are well informed and can contribute to the solution. We need the citizens to do their own task, to behave responsibly, to be careful, to take care about their health and health of others. There is a big portion of solidarity in everything we are doing, and these are the narratives we try to promote also through our strategic communication, which we, as I said at the beginning, try to improve.
So I think you bring up a really important point here about citizens' responsibility. I mentioned earlier the notion of a whole of society approach, which involves actions from governments, private sector, and civil society and media groups. But of course, individuals have a key role to play in having a more critical lens, a better understanding when they share information on their social media platforms, how they assess the accuracy of information. But there is a lot of pressure, I think, and responsibility placed on individuals who already find themselves during this pandemic era at a level of high anxiety and high stress about the public health situation. So what I wanted to, where I'm getting to with this is another initiative that was quite revolutionary, I think, in the broader sense of government activities to counter disinformation, and that's the Code of Practice. And the reason I bring that up is because it was the first initiative we saw by a government entity, in this case, the European Union, to try to bring platforms to the table in a more coordinated way and really test to what extent platforms voluntarily can take that kind of responsibility to better monitor the content that's being shared, rather than placing all the responsibility on the citizen, on the individual. And the Code of Practice has been now in action, has been implemented for some years. Now that we've seen some of the reports that major platforms have been submitting over time, how would you assess how effective the Code of Practice has been in terms of ushering kind of a common set of understanding between the private sector companies and governments? As perhaps a follow-up to that, some interesting news recently was that TikTok recently was invited to join the Code of Practice. And that was seen as a bit of a controversial move by some. But I wanted to get you to talk about a little bit the Code of Practice in itself and how effective you think it's been, and the recent decision to include TikTok as one of the companies participating in the Code of Practice.
I will start with this TikTok. We welcome all the platforms where the people moved their activities, and from where the people take their opinions and their inspirations. We want to involve all of them. So I am glad that TikTok has moved towards committing itself for the Code of Practice. It has some history. We came with the Code of Practice before the European elections and after Cambridge Analytica case. Before European elections, we really tried to actively respond on new threats, which we clearly saw that to organize elections, it's not just a distribution of the leaves for the vote and the campaign and so on. There are new threats. Abuse of private data, which we saw in Cambridge Analytica case. Cyber security is a big issue now. And of course, disinformation and use of artificial intelligence in political campaigning, and lack of transparency in political campaigning. Our member states did not react sufficiently on the fact that the political campaigning is shifting from offline to online world. So it was the atmosphere when we agreed on this voluntary mechanism with the platforms. The Code of Practice also included the possible use of so-called rapid alert system, which was not used before the elections, by the way. And this voluntary action, I don't want to look like somebody who is naive, but when I negotiate with the platforms how far they want and can go in their voluntary and proactive action. I speak to real people. The managers of big tech are real people, and I sometimes hear something like, we do not want to be abused for dirty games by people who want to destroy democracy and who want to do harm to people and societies. I hear it there. And here come the values. I was able to come to some common denominator with the managers of the platform on what is still acceptable and what's unacceptable. So I have always had a very positive approach on internet as an instrument for connecting people, education, communication, and so on. But at the same time, we have the obligation to address the big risks which are there without introducing any kind of censorship. No Ministry of Truth. I am not going to become the Commissioner of Truth. I don't want Mark Zuckerberg to be the arbiter of truth. Nothing like that. That's why, not to speak too long, we built on the code of practice. And when we now came with the COVID-related anti-disinformation paper, and we enforced two things: the fact-checking, which is, I think, a very practical way how to help the people to have the facts available easily. Yeah. The second thing, and I spoke about it, the proactive care of the sector. It was the health sector. And the third thing, again, the transparency issue. We ask the platforms to monthly report on what's happening in their systems, because we know about what's happening there only from the when we ask, we get the answers. But we would like the public, not the Commission, the public, to be systematically and continuously informed about the cases of coordinated intensive disinformation wave, coordinated disinformation which has been produced to do public harm. That's the definition we use. We want the public to be informed about the sources where possible. Sometimes it's not easy to trace the origin, but we want the platforms to invest in better detection of the sources. The third thing, the manipulative technique which is used, including whether there is artificial intelligence involved, the bots and some other new instruments. And the fourth, it's who are the targets. And here comes the complication for the platforms. I am aware of it, that I am very demanding because we want the reports to be country specific. Yeah? We want the platforms to inform the citizens in each European country in their language to know what is happening and whether there are some manipulative attempts to influence their opinions and to make them more nervous and more anxious and so on. So these are the novelties.
Thank you. Thank you for elaborating that. I want to pick up on a point you made about the voluntary nature of the code of practice. And one of the big issues that's been on the European agenda for some time, certainly pre-COVID, has been a seemingly ambitious Digital Services Act. There has been some reporting and in the media that the monitoring of illegal content moderation that is construed to be illegal, is going to be one of the focus areas in the Digital Services Act. So is there a timeline for the Digital Services Act now that you can update us on, and anything you can share about what you anticipate to be the focus areas of that particular regulatory effort?
Yes, thank you for giving me a chance to explain the work of the Commission on not only on disinformation, but also on illegal content. These are two different things. If we declare disinformation illegal content, it might be the end of the freedom of speech in the EU. We are not going to do that, because who is able to define what is the opinion protected by the free speech and what is the disinformation which has been produced to do harm? We will try to come with a definition, but we saw also now in COVID crisis in half of the member states, spreading of fake news is to spread the panic is the criminal offense in the criminal laws. And of course it raised attention because in some cases it was used against the people who simply came with the opinion that the government is not doing enough. And you know, this is a very subtle and sensitive issue, how to define disinformation. But the Digital Services Act will deal with the illegal content, which is defined clearly by the criminal law in all the member states. Here we speak about child abuse materials and child pornography. We speak about the promotion of terrorism, promotion of extremism, and we speak about manifestly clear hate speech which has the potential to incite hate crime and real violence in the real world. And here we will come with the Digital Services Act, which will define better the obligations of the platforms, their increased responsibility and their increased proactivity or proactive approach towards the illegal content. So we have to define between this disinformation and this kind of illegal content. Let me explain one more thing. I know I speak long, but I sometimes use the comparison from real world. Just imagine you have a house, and every week on Friday you organize a party, and every Friday some woman is raped in your house. So the police will come again and again and will try to find the perpetrator of the rape. But if they have to come every week, one day the police will ask the owner of the house whether he took proper measures, sufficient measures to protect the people who are the guests on his party. And this is a very similar case. And when I speak to the managers of the platforms, they understand that they have to be much more active in not leaving the crime being distributed through their systems. So this is, you'd ask about the timeline. This should come both the Digital Services Act and the European Democracy Action Plan, which deals with disinformation and elections, by the end of the year. So we don't have much time, but I am happy we are speeding up. We are not prolonging and taking any delays on that, because we want to very soon come with the European way, European vision for digital. And I believe that Europe can do this right, because we have proved that we have a good instinct when it comes to digital world. We have the GDPR, which came some years ago. There's a proper concept that your privacy belongs to you. You cannot sell it. You cannot let somebody else to abuse it or monetize it. So this year, the end of the year.
Thank you for the update. That's good to know. We're certainly tracking the developments on the EU's digital agenda very closely in the United States. In many ways, what the Commission has been doing in this space is setting a global precedent, not just a precedent for Europe. And you mentioned the GDPR, which of course has become essentially a global law now. because social media platforms are used by everyone around the world, not just by Europeans or Americans or Canadians. And so now we've seen the European Union really setting the global agenda on digital policy and digital regulation. And so for that reason, all the work you're doing to think, I think, very strategically and in a very nuanced manner about how you differentiate between child pornography, terrorism, that section of illegal content, versus, disinformation, which is in a bit of a gray zone often, that is not clearly illegal content, but is misleading content with an intent to influence or publics or produce public harm. And that's a much more difficult thing to deal with. So I understand how difficult your work is, and what you're going to be doing in the future will continue to be, I think, controversial for the reasons of the issue being such a challenge and such a difficult thing to grab our hands around. Go ahead.
I myself have very good immunity because I lived half of my life in the regime where there was the only one doctrine, one opinion, something which the Slovakian writer Dominik Tatarka called the demon of consent. Yeah, and I remember that very well. We were listening to the Voice of America with my parents very silently. I heard from my parents, do not say it anywhere because we would have a big problem. So I do not want to introduce one official doctrine and one only protected truth. So this is my personal task, and I promise.
Well, you and I have very similar backgrounds in that way. I have similar memories of listening to Radio Liberty, Radio Svoboda, when I was growing up in the Soviet Union. And I think as an organization that works on Central Eastern Europe as our case of study, we know very well that many citizens from the former, if you forgive me, the former Soviet space have, quite a high level of critical thinking when it comes to identifying propaganda. And I think there's a lot to be learned within Europe between member states as to how to engender that kind of critical thinking among citizens. I mean, in some ways, that's been the one, I suppose, positive thing that we've taken away from generations and lifetime of repression during the Soviet era was our ability to be skeptical about the kind of information we're receiving from certain sources. I don't want to, I have my eyes on the clock, but if you have maybe 2 additional minutes, if you don't have to run right away, okay. There are a couple of questions from the audience that I would like to pose to you. One is from the former president of RFERL, Thomas Kent, who's asking the following. Vice President Jourová, you said in an interview with Euronews that the EU would never use the term dirty propaganda against those spreading disinformation against the EU. But at the same time, you said you were shocked by opinion polls showing that some Italians consider France and Germany to be enemy nations. So many believe the EU needs to do more and step up its efforts, not to combat disinformation about itself, these negative narratives. How do you foresee being able to do that? You started to touch a little bit on the strategic communication elements. This is a question asking, is there a plan to step up those efforts?
Well, yes, I was shocked by that. And this COVID crisis told us a lot of new things about ourselves. And simply, we have to be able to better promote the ability of the EU to act together and to show solidarity and to help to each other. The start of COVID was it was a stress test for European solidarity, and all the states were doing what they had to do to solve the health problem within their territory. We could not trigger the European civil protection mechanism, which works when part of the states are endangered, the others are helping. So it was a totally new situation. But still, I was shocked, and we will never use dirty propaganda. We will, however, have to more intensively and better inform the citizens about what we are doing and what they can expect from us. And not only to speak about it, but to do practical things for the people to see that we are useful. We Democrats are able to solve the problems, the serious problems. Now the EU budget should be sold also better, so that the people understand what we want to invest in and many other things. Proactive, positive communication and delivery of the facts. That's the way we want to go.
Thank you. And just one last very quick question, which is a follow-up to what you just laid out about informing the public, comes from Rhiannon McNamara, who's asking, what can people with little political education look for to identify Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns? So what can citizens who may not be very aware of Russia, China, and what they're doing, are there some tips that you can give to people for identifying these kinds of misleading information operations?
I think that the people should start using different channels of information. Yeah, not to rely on notoriously used one or two, but the diversity of channels will help. And I mentioned our effort to increase the fact checking, but the messages coming from outside for the Russian disinformation, I would very much and like to recommend study the modern history. So that we should maybe study more the history of the 20th century, and on China, it's a little bit less known territory, and we should also, for that, to be able to recognize the disinformation, really to use several channels and not to rely on only one.
Right, avoid echo chambers, I suppose is the takeaway there. Fully agree with you on your last comment. I think we'll have to leave it there. There are lots of questions we didn't have a chance to get to, but I just want to thank you for joining us for this conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. Before we wrap up, I wanted to quickly let our audience know that if you're interested in how our allies in Europe are responding to the crisis, we'll be holding an event on June 30th, which is next Tuesday, on how NATO is responding to the pandemic. So we'll be closely watching what the Commission does and what you and your staff are doing on this issue. We've had the opportunity at SIPA to host many of your staff for podcasts and all kinds of conversations at this point, and look forward to further engagement with you and everyone working on this important issue in the European Union and the Commission specifically. So Vice President Jourová, thank you so much for joining us. Hope to host you again in a future discussion and wish you the best of luck with everything you're undertaking. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And I wish you all the best, good health and good mood and good weekend. Thank you.
Bye-bye.